take the question in the back there?
Yeah, as far as process goes, what do you think of, with cameras now, a lot of digital cameras can shoot video as well, and that's new. And then the difference between like going backwards and you can take old 35 millimeter movies and scan those and make stills. So is it really about the stillness of it that's a photograph and about printing? Like, is that the problem, is that it doesn't end to print? Because like sometimes I'll scan film and just put it on the web, but I shot film. So is it the question about the final object and also about the motion?
I think that's a great question. And my own sense is that that there's a real big difference between still and moving. You know, they both make fabulous things, but they're very different, even when they're both photographic.
Good. But now cameras make, I mean, the high-end, like SLR cameras now do like HD video. I mean, they all do little like quick times. Or
But
whatever.
there are one little test case, for example, is the famous Vietnam Eddie Adams picture of the guy shooting the guy in the head. There are other cases, but that's a case where that also exists on film.
Right.
And it's much more powerful in the still form, partly because it doesn't go away,
right.
but it also, in PL's terms, there's an inexplicable visceral power to the still picture that isn't there in the film version, even though in a basic literal sense, it's maybe more shocking in the film version because it's more like you're standing there. But however you interpret it, they're very different.
Right. No, I agree. But what I'm saying is then if stillness equates a photograph and therefore photography, that's not over. They're still still.
Yeah, I agree with you.
So, okay.
I have a hunch about this. My hunch is that 10 to 20 years from now, you're not going to buy a still camera and a video movie camera. You're going to buy one camera which does both.
You can already.
Well, okay, fine. You can't get TIFFs. You can't get TIFFs out of the current variety of
You
small.
can, but you probably know that if you work in the commercial world rather than being an artist, because it hasn't hit art schools yet.
Okay, well,
but that's-
so now today what you can do is take stills and movies simultaneously, and it seems to me that Fiona Tan, who works at Amsterdam, did a really remarkable set of pictures which address exactly what you were talking about. What she did was to set up people in various occupations, a la August Zonder's photographs of people, for example, the Gemütlich baker with his stuff, shot him with a video camera and asked him to stand still for 3 minutes in this kind of Zonder pose and shot him in video. And the presentation in the museum was a projected movie of this thing in which you're looking at somebody trying to make himself into a still picture and failing. And there's a very curious kind of push-pull between the motion that the person can't avoid doing and your knowledge of the setup of this picture as being a still picture. And I thought just looking at it, almost pre-critically, suggests that there's something very strange going on between the capacity to make still pictures and the capacity at the same time to be making motion pictures. And my guess is that that's going to get problematized by artists very soon. I mean,
but that's the classic. What a photographer does with their new video kit is make a still that moves for about 3 minutes.
I'm sorry.
But I mean, it's interesting.
Charlotte,
but it's like.
Excuse me. I want to thank you for pointing that out. Okay, go ahead. It's classic and.
Yeah, and the other thing is I think this would be better if you had an arm wrestling competition between experimental filmmakers who feel very passionately about their territory with photographers who want to move over to video. I mean, it's like there are niches everywhere. I mean, it's.
And they're just as disgruntled.
Yeah, and they're just as fed up, and they're worrying if it's over.
The silent majority of disgruntled photographers sort of like wondering about their disenfranchisement. And at the same time, isn't the problem with digital prints that they look just, and people aspire to make them look just like photographic prints? I mean, this kind of stasis, and it's a lot like the avant-garde cinema thing, this sort of like grumpy burrowing in some hillside and then complaining about what's going on outside. And it is so unfathomable to me that one would want to continue to perform a mythologized history, a history that doesn't fully exist or usually wasn't actually even experienced by the people who persist to pretend it's there. Because I care a lot about that history, I care a lot about that work, and I don't want to remake it. And I see what was great about that work is that it was sensitive to its time and place, and it understood it, and it reacted to it, and it's accountable to such a complex set of questions that is not shut down by saying it's not art, or that it's just photography, or it's photography and that's a different set of questions, but it's accountable to a wealth of those questions. And to artificially lop that off, I'm sorry, I was just sort of percolating, and I'm just kind of stunned, but I'm glad to.
I'm sorry. Do you think that there's then
just the same way I like watching Fox News?
To me, but that there is the possibility of a whole completely different way of looking and creating a digital work that has no relationship to the kind of historical look of photography, and that would be an important development.
I think there's something interesting in that possibility. Yeah, that there is.
I'm wondering what it would look like, but that's
That's why it has to get made. But yeah.
Okay,
Sounds like
in
we're
the back
talking about
line.
drag queens.
I guess I wanted to ask everybody about something that Geoff said last night, which I kind of almost fell out of my chair when you were like, Wolfgang Tillmans is sort of a footnote in kind of, the history of photography, or... Can you hear that?
Just a little.
Okay. No, it was something that Geoff said last night about Wolfgang Tillmans being like a footnote in the history of photography, or just in a photographic practice, I suppose. And I started thinking about him, and I started thinking like, well, could you really think of him as a footnote? And I really can't. And
I think you said irrelevant.
Irrelevant? Well, I think he said footnote too. Irrelevant footnote, maybe. I don't know. But so one thing about his practice that I've always enjoyed, and I think a lot of people enjoy, and is his fluidity that he has between moving through abstraction and these things that are medium specific. He couldn't make some of the work that he's making without the fact that photography does certain things and chemical photography does certain things that it does in relationship to the other, images or pictures that he makes. So I think in that case alone that he's a very important practitioner. So, and then that got me thinking about, somebody like Walead, who, part of your work you couldn't make if it wasn't, a certain set of reasons of these things that are inherent to photography, or somebody like Marco Breuer, who, his work is sort of based in these things that photography is and does. And I don't want to like fetishize the sort of material aspects of the medium.
Go ahead.
What's
that?
that? Okay.
It's fine.
Okay. But, and I don't want to sort of like put, a lot of emphasis on the nostalgia of these material processes, or if, someone is making a contemporary daguerreotype, or if someone's making a contemporary tintype, a lot of times I think that work gets looked at as like, well, why the hell are they doing that? And someone would be doing that because it does something that nothing else in the history of the world has done. It looks very different, and it sort of adds a set of conceptual framework to the object that nothing else can. So I guess we've been talking about all this, but can we talk about some of that, or Wolfgang Tillmans or something? So.
Just very, very quickly, that was probably me rashly plucking some sort of, name out of a bag, really. On the other hand, it does seem to me surprising that people could be more interested in looking at those pictures than those by any number of kind of photojournalists, all of whose names now escape me, as sometimes happens.
Well, maybe, and I asked this in private somewhat, but you both touched on Wolfgang's work, Joel, Geoff, that it indicated a kind of stopping point where the conversation got uninteresting for you. And I'm curious, I mean, it tacitly sort of asserted an idea of what the parameters were or the boundaries of this discussion were for you, what photography represented. And I was curious if you might articulate, I mean, his work is not interchangeable with photojournalistic work. I mean, you couldn't confuse one for the other. So it's not a question of which flavor of soda you like better. But it's something about the role of that and what you find uninteresting, or what it's doing that seems to seem distinct from what aspect of photography that you're engaged with, like how you define it. I'm more curious how you define that boundary, I guess, than whether or not it's interesting or not. I'm curious about that boundary and what the significance is. I think it has a lot to do with your particular vantage point. So I don't know, either of you.
My voice is giving out, so it's going to be difficult. In listing the photographers whom I list in the 500 words I produced, I was not taking sides or saying these were the good guys or these were the bad guys. I was asking a very different question, and that is, what kind of story might one have to come up with to connect the blue chip canonical figures excuse me, of Beaumont Newhall certified photography and contemporary artists. And my suggestion was, and this reflects on my own poverty as a narrative maker, my suggestion is that it can't be done without screwing up the history of the earlier stuff. If you can show, somebody actually tried to do this. Ansel Adams made 4x5 blow-ups, 4-foot by 5-foot blow-ups of Moonrise over Hernandez, which were used to advertise his shows, one at a collection that I helped curate. I did curate, a private one. And that was pointed to by people who needed to find an anchor in the old practice for the new practice of making 4-foot by 5-foot enlargements. And it just struck me as kind of silly. Adams, when I asked him about what I should do with this 4x5-foot print, said, throw the damn thing out. It was not the kind of thing that was ever accessioned or whatever. It was a stunt to draw attention through actually bank windows. So my point in the written thing is I actually like some of Tillman's work very much. I love Walead Ra'ad's work. I think it's sensational. I frankly didn't think you could do that, what he's doing. All that I'm saying is that if you're going to try to connect Walead Ra'ad to Paul Strand, you're a better storyteller than I am.
There's many photographers. That's the real problem.
Next question down
Not
here.
digital.
Hi, I came from London for this, and I was kind of worried that photography was over and that nobody would be here. So I'm pleased to see that it isn't over, A, because none of you seem to be able to agree what photography is, and secondly, there are a lot of people here. But I wanted to just add some things to that disagreement, or the lack of certainty about what photography is, or right now, seems to be right. And I think your three topics, your three questions hit the spot really, although I noticed you wriggled out of the artist-photographer dichotomy around the language of that in terms of art photography. So digital domain changing things technologically, notions of photography becoming much more dominant in the art institution globally, not just in Europe, but globally. And thirdly, kind of social attitudes changing. And I think those three things together are producing a kind of uncertainty. And I don't know, some of you are probably familiar already with the book by Janet Wolfe, written about 3 years ago, called Aesthetics of Uncertainty, which define our own time, which I suspect is actually a constant, because I think it's very easy for us to look back now at narratives of the 20th century photography nostalgically, which is, nostalgia is looking back to a thing that never existed, and the narratives we write about the past culturally or our own families are always kind of selected memories. So in that sense, I think it's easy to imagine that there was always much more certainty in the 20th century than there actually was in photography in its story. So I think uncertainty is probably crucial right now. And I see this in Europe too. I'm going to quite a big conference in Germany that's set up by Essen School in relation to the gallery there, simply called Teaching Photography with a question mark. And it has people from all over Europe going to it. I don't think there's any invitations were thrown out to North or South America, but it's quite a big gathering. And also in London, right, in a couple of weeks, there's a big conference organised by the Hayward called Deschooling Art. And there's a whole sense, I think, that there's a kind of, if not a crisis, but a kind of uncertainty about what the values are. And I've just heard that echoed today on this panel with, and I can kind of feel it. Critics are saying this in London as well, a kind of congealing of art photography around a certain set of values that seem to be slightly over, like big prints are just embarrassing now after the sort of recession, and it's easy to get a laugh out of them because of that, in a sense, but no one speaks about that underlying sense of the extravagance of that. And the technological changes too seem to have had quite a big impact on students. And so just one more thing. What's really interesting about the young British artist who made it in the 90s in photography is that I think there's only one of them was actually ever anywhere near a photography department. Most of them came out of fine art courses that don't teach photography. They might have somebody with a studio or something, but they don't have anyone teaching photography. Most of them came out of art courses, of which there are 30 in the UK, and there are 150 photography courses. Now, all of those 150 photography courses are now referring to those YBA artists who made it doing fine art, who were not taught photography, and when they had like hideously magenta prints, thought they were great because they didn't know that was a bad print, like the photography students. And that whole kind of collapse, in a sense, of a certain specific value system for photographers, I think has precipitated a kind of question, and maybe not a crisis, but a questioning about what to teach. And that echoes all the way through, I think, through museums about what kind of narratives that I hear people here asking as well. And so in a sense, I feel that the uncertainty is actually quite exciting, in a sense. I see a lot of exciting work that comes from students from the Middle East, from the Orient, as we used to call it, and so on. And I see great work on mobile phones too. I love grain, I love pixels as a photographer, but I also love fine prints. And that sense of openness, I think, is part of our contemporary condition. So I guess that's more of a comment rather than a question.
In the back there?
Yeah. The first thing, I was just curious if we could restate the fourth dialogue that was not really on the table today, before I propose my question. I'm sorry.
It's a secret.
I don't want to get it wrong.
No. Okay, the fourth one, if you want to ask about it, was, there were some questions about, I guess, the market has now come up. That's an institutional factor. It's about institutional context, and I guess certain kind of relations of power and differences of status in different contexts.
Okay, so I had heard that, and then I really attached more to somewhere a few minutes later where you're discussing, well, I guess it's interwoven, policing the boundaries of art. And I think maybe there's a lot of heads shaking yes, that it's happening more now than ever. I don't know. I'm 26. To me, the last decade, it would seem very much that case. So really, I guess there's a concern that I have that two of the topics today seem to be more about observing the state of where we are with photography, art photography. And then the other two things are less about observing and actually are things that we dictate. If I can just put you all in a blanket, I'm really sorry to do that. I actually appreciate everything everyone's saying. But maybe we're saying that the ontological relationship between the viewer and photography, we're discussing that, but that's really something we observe. We're not really gonna determine if black and white photography disappears if our children see an image and feel some sort of relationship to an object or not. That's going to be without us. But at the same time, we're discussing that. We also seem to be, to me, as a photographer, I'm a little scared that it seems to me that we almost are policing what photography is, that this whole process isn't just about is photography over, but what aspects of photography are we calling over? I feel like there's a lot of interfighting about what that looks like, but all I can say is from my perspective, once upon a time I was an artist and people put that hat on me and I had one group of people emailing me and calling me and showing my work. And then I got really frustrated with the last decade, as I think a lot of people did, and I started to make work about war actually happening. And so suddenly those people that email and call me don't anymore. And there's a certain amount of identity to this where it seems like art is defined by what these dialogues we will have and some things that we won't. And I guess that fourth dialogue about policing more than ever, it's very real to me. It's not ho-hum. It's actually, I have felt as though I have been policed out, that by photographing war, I'm now nowhere because I'm not a war photographer per se, and I'm not an artist per se, and these different camps are divided. Another point in time, you have someone like Gustave Courbet, let's just, we can all call that art, that's serious work, and yet he is dealing with issues of the time. It's not, I love Walead, not to pick on him, but we are comfortable in the art context dealing with work that deals with the Lebanon War, 82. I mean, he really deals with that a lot. But contemporaneous work, this is a ghetto, photojournalism, if you're dealing with war. So I guess I want to introduce that to kind of problematize what I do feel is happening here. We are kind of determining not is photography over, but what aspects are over, and what identities we get to have for art photography. And if you're not there, well, that's another thing we're kind of, it seems to me we're saying. I think that might have been vague. I hope you guys can inform me a little bit.
You seem to be saying that we didn't say enough and then we said too much. I don't know. Maybe I got something wrong there. I mean, I don't think this panel is in accord about more than one thing, maybe, and that's that our asses hurt. So I don't know how we're limiting the definition of this discourse. I mean, it's an impossible question. I mean, the whole thing. And I think it was made clear from the very beginning that photography has expanded in such a way that it's really hard to define what it really is. So no matter what you say about photography, it is by necessity limited to a fraction of it. So I mean, that's my response.
I actually thought the reference to Courbet was kind of interesting because, of course, Courbet was excoriated for his inclusion of the everyday in his art as not being appropriate. And I mean, that's part of what made him such a powerful figure was how sort of scandalous that was. But I think one of the things we talked around a little bit here was photography's engagement with the real world. And some of us have been talking about a text that the photographer Paul Graham wrote that's been sort of circulating out there. I hate to use the word, the blogosphere. But what Graham wrote was about this sort of absence of a critical language to talk about photography that does what he described in really beautiful language about a dance with the real world, and how there's a real apparatus for talking about art, photography that's like Gursky or Wall, where the artistry or the craft, the conceptual part of it is so clear. And he talked about, how do we talk about what Robert Frank did? There's not a language that works so well for that. And I think that's something that we've talked about a little bit, and I think that you might have been getting at a little bit, that sort of, it's not entirely clear where that kind of work that deals with the actual issues of the real world as it is, where that fits necessarily.
But Graham's wrong. I mean, there is so much scholarship on social documentary practices and debating it and dealing with it and trying to contextualize it. That's usually the bulk of what, at least that I confronted, like the entirety of Contest of Meaning is like our essays on that. Usually when people, at least the most fiery discussions were usually about the premise of social documentary and that history. And I mean, I don't think that that's necessarily. I just don't think that that's true. His premise, I don't find
talking about
true.
social. I mean, I think the use of the word documentary. There's someone in the audience who I know will agree with me. Someone wrote a whole dissertation on this subject, but the word documentary is just so problematic that he's not talking about social documentary photography with an agenda. He's talking about this idea of being in the world, visualizing it, pressing the shutter at a certain moment and making this photograph that comes from that experience. So his use of the term documentary is so loaded at this point that it's not really useful, although it is the term that he uses. I don't know what a better one is, but because straight photography, it's not very helpful either.
Still photography.
Still photography.
You don't think there's a lot of great critical writing on that subject as opposed to about Geoff Wall? To me, it seems, I'm in total agreement with him, that the bulk of good critical writing about photography is about the Robert Frank, Ellen Levitt, Walker Evans kind of photography. Only the most recent stuff is obsessed with the Geoff Wall, I made it myself.
I'm just reporting what this text, what this sort of general feeling is. But I do think that kind of photography is much more difficult to talk about. I mean, that doesn't mean it hasn't been done.
The artist hasn't made a self-conscious effort to embody what the critical discussion should be in his work, as Geoff Wall and those guys.
That was Graham's point.
Although I do think it was him trying to embody that. I mean, there was certain him wanting to make sure that we all understood that he represents the front of the barricades on that point, right?
I think that we got maybe a little bit off, that it wasn't. I think that what Paul Graham's essential message was that that in other kinds of art, like fancy brushwork, you see right away that there's the art of it. And I'm not necessarily endorsing or not endorsing this view. I'm just trying to clarify what I think he was trying to get at, which is that in the art of descriptive photography, that's the term I would use now to avoid the loaded documentary thing. That just you go out and take a picture of the world. That it looks just like all the other pictures that are out there in the newspaper, and that we all see a lot of photographs all the time, and that its artistic dimension doesn't have an obvious marker. I think it wasn't. I think that's what he was talking. That it does in some areas of descriptive photography, like Edward Weston, for example. It does have an obvious marker, which is the exquisiteness of the print, and that everything's sharp, and that all the surfaces are beautifully described, and that's an obvious marker of artistic artistry control. But that there's a lot of photography where the essential artistic element doesn't have that kind of obvious marker. And I think that's all he was pointing out.
Yes, please.
So my question is about, is that okay? Okay. The power of photographic vision. And I have two parts to this question. So the first one, what do you feel is, how dominant is the photographic vision on painting and other imaging systems? for example, like the show upstairs of Luke Toyman is highly influenced by photography, right? A lot of his paintings are coming from photographs. And the other part is, how do you feel that photographic vision has influenced how we see the world? And if we see and value the world as being worth to be photographed, being worthy of of the action of being photographed. So.
I just had a low sugar level.
I see the world as washed out and fuzzy.
Okay. All right. Well, why don't we? I was going to ask George to say something, but I won't. No, just because of the whole thing of, I guess, the expanded idea of the photographic. But I won't, because you said it last night too. But okay, I'm not going to say it. Why don't we just hear from?
Let me just touch on that last thing. It kind of, for me, it goes back to Tillman's. The idea that, for what I love about Tillman's is that he makes me sort of see everything in this through his eyes and as photographic and it's all possible. It's all interesting because I love his vision. So his pants on the floor, the fruit on his windowsill, anything through his eyes has interest for me. And I think that any good photographer will make you see that, so that it doesn't matter what they're looking at, it just matters, in a sense, how they're looking.
And also, I mean, on the subject of Tillman's work, he understands exhibition spaces much better than I've seen almost any other photographer really understand them, and use them in a really dynamic way. I mean, that's one of the possibilities that happens through his practice that I think is pretty unusual and kind of extraordinary, that there's a maintenance of a certain type of photographic vision, one that we can easily identify and understand, and then there's an extension into the understanding of the social space of the gallery that follows very much from the thought process of the production of each individual image, that I think is opens the parameters of the conversation that is possible through his work. Yeah. Instead of just staying inside the frame, there is a possibility to think of the entire space of the exhibition as a kind of frame, to think about that as a compositional and also a social space. So, I mean, yeah.
And it's not always just about the individual picture, it's about the whole range of the wall.
So I think we should take two more questions, two last questions. Maybe. No, I think you were maybe there before.
In the 19th century, when somebody wanted to sell a picture, they made a picture of a little girl, and if it didn't sell, they would paint a picture of a dog next to the little girl, and if it still didn't sell, they would paint a bandage on the little dog's paw. And it seems somewhat in the contemporary art world today, if somebody wants to sell a picture, they make a large colored digital photograph, and if it doesn't sell, they make it even larger, and if it still doesn't sell, they make it colossal, especially if it has some red in it and maybe a little off of focus. I bring this up because I recently saw an exhibition of Robert Polidori's photographs at the Metropolitan Museum, of photographs of some of the scenes of New Orleans after Katrina, and I like Polidori's photographs very much. But in looking at these photographs, I thought, because they were very large photographs in that show, if they were 8 by 10 photographs, they would be documentation of a tragedy. But instead, they were like 40 by 50-inch photographs in big frames, which seemed that they were almost being made, these photographs of this tragedy, as interior decoration for some hedge fund manager's house in Aspen. And that whole nature of taking something in one size that would be a documentation of tragedy and turning it into interior decoration, I find is a bit of a problem. And the problem of scale, that sense of almost of a kind of a painting envy, that sense of trying to make these compete with paintings. And Edgar Degas once said that there's certain types of success that are indistinguishable from panic. And I find when one is going through someplace like Photo with all of these giant, desperately large photographs, that there is a tremendous sense of kind of smiling panic. Unfortunately, in Photo, they can't smoke anymore. They'd still smoke there too. But that sense in the contemporary photo world of that sense of why is there this desperate sense of supersize?
What an incredibly observant man you are. I wonder, like this contemporary art world, I wonder if either camps would really want to take ownership of it, either the contemporary art world or the photo world. When you're talking about that, it's almost this byproduct of a market boom for this thing called contemporary art photography, that it's got to be big and laminated.
Well, it brings up a certain thing.
plexi
If the photograph was taken within the last 10 years and it sells for over $100,000, it goes into the evening sale at Sotheby's or Christie's.
Right.
It's no longer in the photo sale.
Yeah.
And so there's this push and pull. And a lot of those people say, well, one of the reasons it's in that evening sale is because the work is the size of a studio apartment in New York,
And also would appeal to a different collector
Exactly.
set. Yeah.
Right.
We all know size matters. And if you're on the receiving end of the money, nobody's complaining. And that's always going to be the case. Whether it's appropriate is probably what you're really asking. And yes, I mean, there's a reflexive defensiveness that has been a part of photography as long as I can remember, and it has, found some very, very subtle and not so subtle means to associate itself with quality. I mean, let's face it, in the art market, the pheromones of photography just don't make it. It's not sexy enough. It's not pheromones, that's what they are. It's hard to say whether size is something that people just buy to prove that they have something bigger than somebody else. But the problem is you seem to be addressing it at somebody. Like, whose fault is this? I would say it's nobody's fault. It's kind of like nobody would, if nobody bought it, nobody would make it. So where's the problem? The problem lies with the consumer, not the producer.
Well, maybe then the response is that we should get rid of hedge fund managers.
Are they over?
Yeah, I mean, we've just gotten an account of University of Chicago economics.
Well, I think where we are now is that hedge fund managers are the tastemakers. That's what you're saying. They are the definers of good quality art.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions.
If you sell more than the next guy and your stuff is more expensive, is it better? I mean, that's a no-brainer. No, it's not. So,
And there's lots of absolutely invisible artists who sell tons of crap all the time, and I mean, and go straight into some obscure. I mean, I can think of
a ton
hotels that have no real critical reception or public reception, but continue to churn out things like
Stephen
sausages,
Klein
and that's
sells
cool.
pictures of Madonna to hotel chains in Japan and makes as much money as anybody from Dusseldorf.
Yeah.
Okay. I think there's an elephant in the room, and I think it's probably the room and the little elephants on the stage. There are only 3 of them, or 2 or 3 of you, who actually are involved in producing photographs for people to look at. Everybody else has a vested interest in the art market or the museum world. Actually, Geoff, this is not quite true of you, but so the perspective you're bringing is a presumption of the necessity of the institution. And I think the role of the photographer was, until about 25 years ago or whenever, a documentarian. Whether it was Aceh or whether it was a front-brain back brain, I don't know the difference, PL, but when you talk about Diane Arbus, she said that the reason she took photographs was historical, that there were things people wouldn't see if she didn't photograph them. And so there's and it's not about documentary photography, it's about the photograph as document. That was what it was. And then suddenly it was discovered that if instead of looking and seeing and having wonder, you talked about it, if you could talk up a storm, if your pictures didn't exist without the talk, Geoff Wall, Gursky, they don't exist unless you can get into a conversation about them.
They're hard to deny that they exist. They assert their
right. They might
existence
fall
pretty.
on you.
I mean, what do you mean by they don't exist without talking?
You don't look. Well, this is a dangerous place for us to get, but you don't look at these things and immediately have a sense of wonder about the content. This is a really bad place to go right now. My point is they got big. The people who make them can talk them up a storm, and then they started selling because they were talked up a storm. They were bigger, and they became an essential part of the art scene. And then this dilemma, this dichotomy came up between the photograph as the document and the photograph as a work of art. And I think that somewhere in here, the reason if photography is dying, it's not dying. How many billion photographs are being posted every day that are documents of somebody's life being shared with everybody else? If there are too many, the only reason there are too many is because there's no mechanism for getting them into a museum. You can't put 50 billion photographs a day into a museum, but they're incredibly... Pardon?
Thank God.
Well, exactly. But what I'm saying is so last night when we were talking about this afterwards, the issue was not is photography dying, what is dying? Are photographers dying? Or maybe museums are dying? That how you present this stuff is a really big deal. And one last thing, Charlotte, when I grew up in England, there were museums and there were galleries. Galleries where flat things were on walls. Museums were repositories for historical documents, information, and material. And that's a huge... And when I came to New York and I found I was going to museums, I wondered why all this flat stuff was on the walls. I thought I was looking at repositories of stuff. And I think this distinction between the document and the work of art, which I'm not derogating as... I'm just saying that they're very different. They're very different. That's all. Thank you.
Neil, you're forgetting one really important thing. Of course, Diane Arbus's work is about the world out there and that she was responding to these people. But for me, the key thing is you could have somebody who knew how to get the camera in focus and go around and photograph all the same people that Arbus photographed. They'd be documented, they'd be all there, and all the art of Diane Arbus would disappear. And what's so incredible, and it is the art that she made out of responding to those people. That's what matters, not the fact that these people got photographed.
Well, I agree with you completely.
But
she was documenting them, and there are different qualities of documentarian. I mean, I'm not disputing that.
There are a whole lot of words in Pencil of Nature. I mean, there was a whole lot of talking that Talbot did about what the intent and what the context were for each of those individual plates. And I mean, I think, there certainly were a great deal of artistic aspirations for the use of photography that didn't situate it as simply a document of what was going on, but were conscious of it as a material. I don't know, Hartfield,
I think they were fundamentally rooted in the idea that they were a record, and what they were a record of was incredibly important, the detail of it, all the stuff within, but they were not somebody's...
But people brought up Peach Robinson, Ray Lander. I mean, there's from the get-go, these were...
They're not the product of somebody's idea laid into the photographic form.
But Two Ways of Life was all commentary and all idea. He was organizing an allegory. I mean, and that's help me, like 1870, huh? 1857.
But I think the older ideas were ideas that the viewer, uninformed, could grasp by looking at the
Thank you.
picture. Whereas the new ideas of Geoff Wall and Andrei Skursky require that you be in on a secret that the photographer could tell you if you knew him, and that is that this is staged, or this is photoshopped, or this is altered. So there is a difference between the document that is accessible essentially to the viewer. The mysteriousness of creation is not accessible, but the document and its meaning and its ideas are accessible to the viewer 50, 100 years later or at the time, but that's not true in the same way of the ones that have an idea that involves changing something that only the inner circle knows about.
But I think
Did
that,
everybody hear that? Okay.
I think that one could argue that there's a context, say, in the case of Arbus and what the relationship were to these sitters that is opaque when you walk through a museum and you see the photograph and you get a title. That you don't necessarily know what the conditions were under which the photograph was made. And I think there's always going to be a missing context in that way that you could treat as a secret.
But
And
if you stand in front of them for long enough, or see enough of them, without ever hearing a word from Leanne Arbus herself, you will glean something of that relationship. But I don't think you will in front of a Geoff Wall picture.
If you stand in front of the best pictures of Geoff Wall and Andreas Gursky, and you don't have some kind of visceral response to them, then I feel very sorry for you. There is no secret.
The
There's
secret
a
of
picture
production?
standing in front of you. You can look at it.
If there's a secret, I mean, Duchamp had a secret, and Jackson Pollock had a secret too. Knowing more about the particular games they were playing, or their critiques, or their objective, or the theory behind it, enhanced understanding of those earlier works. It's part of modernism. Manet was playing a game too that people were confused about.
Let's take, this is the last question.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. I feel remiss for not asking this sooner, because I'm surprised that for 3 hours we've talked about photography, and it's been a leapfrog between the wall in the museum or the gallery and the screen. PL, you said that you didn't even talk about the photo book. Clearly, I have a vested interest in the printed page, but it is one of those economic frameworks that has informed photography, provided a platform for photography, a delivery system, a venue for reception, haptic experience, all of those things. So maybe this is a conversation for a different panel, but I was curious if that came up at all. And I mean, Vince, I love your writing about the printed page, the magazine world. Peter, you posit Henri Cartier-Bresson's career as being informed by the rise of the pictorial magazine. So how could this not come up?
But in what way?
Well, I guess you're talking about loss, and again, I know that I have my own agendas in this, but in the loss of a tactile experience of the photograph, there's something between the wall and the screen, and that's usually the printed page. That historically has been. So,
well, you know, this also impacts the discussion of size. You know, how you appreciate a photograph, how you apprehend it. Well, the intimacy of the experience of photography, which has shifted enormously from, you know, something like, let's say, the Americans, as most people saw it first, to Geoff Wall, which, you know, reminds me of something I, first saw in a train station. I think it is a larger discussion, and it also connects to the discussion, which is part of photography that we haven't talked about. That, I mean, I am a photographer, but I also am not a fine art photographer exclusively. I've done a lot of things for other medias or usages of photography. And those are all disappearing. And there may not be, photography may not be over, but there are aspects of it that are very definitely over. I would say magazines are soon to be gone.
I know I'm totally in denial about this, but it seems to me every time I go to a magazine stand, there are more magazines than there were last time.
Well, I don't mean magazines as that's like, just because they invented disposable diapers doesn't mean that, somebody's not wiping their kid's ass with a towel. But I don't know what.
I'm not sure where we're going.
God, you were so busy being heterosexual, and then you suddenly become a parent. It's just like, what's God?
I want to see a magazine of Pierre diCorcia's collected analogies. Even just out of this program, I think would be.
Can I answer?
I also think that the last time in New York, there's been for the past several years an art book fair that every year has gotten larger, and that really makes me feel like it's not going away. And not only not going away, but there are more artists making books, more photographers putting their work into books than ever before.
Yeah.
Often because that's their favorite delivery system. It's still a great way to present work. It gives them a lot more power than it might in a gallery system. But also that there is, I think, a still real need and desire to see work in that way, to see work on the printed page. And I as I said, I refuse to have the idea that magazines are going away. They're still a very valuable way to get photos into the world. And I think that if they're going away, they're not doing it any day soon.
I hope that's the case, actually, but it reminds me of the argument about global warming that says, we had a pretty chilly winter. I'm not sure there is such a thing as global warming. When it happens, it's going to happen fast.
So I'm not even going to try and, I'm obviously not going to try and conclude this. I'm not even going to try to summarize it. I don't feel like I'm in the position to do that. But I'm just going to say a word about what seemed to me the feeling over these, for us, 3 sessions and two public sessions. And I think it's been, for one thing I would say is I quite appreciate the durational nature of a program like this. I think that I want to say that, a lot of programs in museums are very tightly and neatly packaged and little mini spectacles. And I appreciated the openness and generosity and sort of sense of exploration that everyone's brought to this. But the feeling I've had all along is that there are whole passages of time go by where people seem to think there isn't a question here. And then you have these moments, these kind of flashes where suddenly something quite urgent and important appears. And then something of that is that's lost sight of again. And so it seems to me that there are things that are vital in this topic, and I'm sure these issues are going to be taken forward into other contexts and other forums. So I'm just going to end by very much thanking you for your attendance in this and for your participation and generosity, and also the panel here for their role in this too. Thank you very much. This symposium is over.